This is The Civil Fleet, the podcast focused on activist led refugee rescue and support missions across Fortress Europe, with me, Ben Coles. In today's episode, we are going to speak with freelance investigative journalist Nicola Kelly about two articles that she wrote this year for the Guardian newspaper. The first article is about the UK government sending £3 million to the Turkish border guards so that they can stop people on the move from entering their country from Iran. The second article we're going to talk about is about asylum seekers being abused and intimidated by staff at Home Office hotels. You might remember that the Home Office has been housing asylum seekers in hotels since the COVID outbreak in 2020, and a little bit before that actually too. Anyway, check the show notes for links to those articles and other topics that are mentioned in this episode. Before we get started, I'd like to remind you that the Civil Fleet is not just a podcast. We've also a website at civilfleet.com, and we've much more stories there, interviews, exclusive stories, and that kind of stuff. So go to civilfleet.com for more of that. Actually, while we're talking about that, you might have noticed I've not published much on there recently. Life and work is getting in the way, but hopefully we'll get back to publishing stories there soon. Also, if you enjoy the Civil Fleet podcasts and you'd like to help us to platform the journalists, activists, lawyers, people on the move, etc. that we have on here, then please consider supporting us. You can give us a small donation or an absolutely massive wad of change if you like. To do that, go to ko-fi.com/civilfleet. That's ko-fi.com/civilfleet. Any money that you can donate will be greatly appreciated. Right, that is enough from me. Let's get on with the show. All right, Nicola Kelly, thank you very much for coming on the Civil Fleet podcast.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You are a journalist, a freelance journalist, and I've wanted to get you on the podcast for a while, so thank you very much for coming on. We're going to talk today about two articles that you've done recently, both for The Guardian. One is about the UK funding the Turkish border guards, and the other is about abuse that is happening in asylum seeker hotels, or abuse that's happening in hotels that are hosting asylum seekers in the UK. Before we get into those, Nicola, could you give us a background about yourself? Tell us a little about who you are and what kind of work you've done. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I'm Nicola Kelly. I'm a freelance journalist. I tend to write for The Guardian, The Observer, a bit for The Independent. Do some work for Channel 4 News at the moment, Tortoise Media, various different places, kind of lefty outlets, if you like. And for my sins, I used to work at the Home Office briefly in 2014. So that experience led me into journalism. So it was off the back of that horrendous year, nearly a year, that I decided to leave and start reporting on the Home Office instead of actually working for them.
Can you talk about that much and what the experience was like at the Home Office?
Yeah, I mean, it was some years ago. Yeah, I mean, as I say, it was bad enough for me to want to leave the civil service. So I've been working at the Foreign Office for 5 years or so. So I've been posted overseas, and I'd done a number of back-to-back postings. So I had to come back to the UK, and I'd already worked in press office in London for the Foreign Office, and so I could have gone back there, but then I was offered this job in the Home Office, and they said, we can give you an international facing job. So that will sort of be in keeping with your sort of background. So I was really excited about this and thought, oh, brilliant, I'll go and work on the immigration and security desk, as it was at the time, which is quite a broad brief. There was lots of specialist desks. There was the policing desk. There was lots of kind of campaigns and stuff. There was a big campaign at the time actually about like um, smoking outdoors and all this kind of thing. So the Home Office were putting loads of money into campaigning and actually not that much into specialist desks like the immigration desk. And there was only four of us on there from memory. So there was a chief press officer, senior press officer, and then two press officers. And I was one of the press officers. So one of the more junior people on that desk. And it was just like absolutely like chaotic on a day-to-day basis. There was the sort of like news desk who would respond to calls, but they would just farm them through to us. So our phones were constantly ringing. And from memory, the other specialist desks didn't get nearly the number of calls that we did. But But yeah, it was really full on, and I mean, obviously we had like a number of different scandals coming out at the time. It was
Was
kind of
this?
the
Did you say this was in 2014 under Theresa May? Was this then?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So she was homesick at the time, and James Brokenshire, the
Mm.
late James Brokenshire, it was immigration minister. Um, so yeah, it was a chaotic place to be, and there was just constant scandals coming out, and my job was basically to kind of counter brief or rebut. Or try and kill stories, which now I see it from the other side as a journalist. When they try and kill my stories, I'm like, I know exactly what you're trying to do. So it's very useful as a journalist to have that experience and
Yeah,
understanding of
absolutely.
the way it works.
My experience of calling the Home Office is they're generally very salty with journalists and do not want to speak to us.
Oh yeah, 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 yeah. They'll sort of be like, "Hi, Nicola. Yeah, yeah," and sort of try and stall a little bit. And I'm sure we'll come on to this about the Turkey story. Yeah, there was lots of backwards and forth about this, and the abuse in hotels actually, which ended up being an incredibly hard fought story to get published.
Yeah, like they're both amazing
So
stories, and you've got quite a long. I've been following your work for a while, and you've got lots of like really good investigative stories that you've done. So it's great to get you on. It's great to get you on the podcast to talk about two of them. And if there's any more you want to talk about, like during this podcast, just bring them up. That's cool. And I'm going to have links for people listening. You can look in the show notes and I'll have links to some other stories that you've got there. Um, so we've done a few stories about the UK recently. The podcast we kind of focus a lot on Europe, and recently I've done quite a few episodes on the UK. So this is quite a broad question, but how would you sort of sum up the situation, the situation for asylum seekers in the UK at the moment, or what do you think are like the biggest, most critical issues surrounding immigration? You know, we've got this illegal immigration bill. There's asylum seekers in hotels that might be taken out of hotels and put on barges. What are your thoughts about it? What do you think are the most sort of critical things
mm.
happening at the moment? I know this is a really broad question.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's loads of different experiences of the different ways that people sort of navigate the asylum system. So there's kind of so-called irregular and regular routes, and the regular routes are rarely covered in the press. So regular routes are kind of student visas and spousal visas, where there's a minimum income requirement where people have to earn. I think it's £18,600 to be able to get their spouses in. And then there's the irregular routes, and trafficking obviously kind of falls within that. But then the small boats is obviously the kind of like highly politicized, political hotcake of an issue, because the optics are so bad for the government, particularly in the lead up to a general election. Um, in general, the experience for asylum seekers is incredibly, it's hostile, it's really dehumanizing. You've got people who are, high skilled workers who are sort of left to languish in hotels for months and sometimes years. Um, yeah, I mean it's horrific. I spoke to an Afghan lawyer the other day who was, sort of prosecuting until the Taliban takeover in August 2021. Who's just been stuck in this hotel, and he's desperate to try and work. I was in Sheffield a couple of weeks ago, and I spoke to a Libyan surgeon with English better than mine, absolutely immaculate English, who'd gone round to hospitals in the area, and he'd asked, for any work, I'll be a porter, I'll be anything, I'll work, in admin, whatever it takes, I just want to work. But they are not permitted to work, not permitted to study until after 6 months. And basically left to languish in these horrific hotels. I think the main thing for them, for people I speak to, and I speak to asylum seekers sort of day in day out. I speak to lots of people on the front line, but particularly asylum seekers themselves about the experience, and they're sort of seen as collateral really at the moment. They're seen as kind of they're sort of stuck in the middle of this incredibly toxic politicized debate about sort of where to put them, how much they cost in this really hard hit economy which is sort of rapidly nosediving, and funneled into these hotels, really long waiting times, up to sort of 18 months on average, could be up to 2 years, even longer, to wait for a decision on their claim. So they're sort of living in limbo. for a really, really long time. And then you occasionally see these clashes outside hotels, like in Knowsley, and yeah, and then it becomes clear that they are stuck in the middle of this maelstrom, and they are, as ever, but particularly in the lead up to a general election, they are um, the ultimate scapegoat. You know, the foreigner is the ultimate scapegoat. So it's a pretty bleak picture, I would say, for them from their perspective. But often what people say is they're just incredibly full of gratitude to be safe, to be given a roof over their heads. And while the food is, incredibly, it's moldy, raw chicken and things like that, they people always tell me how grateful they are to be here. So there is a sort of silver lining in that they're safe and alive, and can start to rebuild their futures.
It's like when sometimes you get I think the sometimes in the media it comes across that like refugees are there's hundreds of millions of people all trying to get here, right? I don't know if you saw this thing that Al Jazeera did like a flow chart, a graph. It was really like nice infographs. I think that's what you call them, showing which countries have the most refugees and stuff. And I think out of the top 10 or whatever, the UK is not even in there. It's so far down, right? Um, the numbers of people that come here are so few compared to elsewhere in the world. But you'd think it would be otherwise, right? If you read in some of the reports here or see some of the reports, it's really sad how much of an
Mhm.
issue it is, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's like 87% of people who flee, displaced people, remain in neighboring countries and in developing countries. We take a fraction of what other European countries take, let alone developing countries. I mean, France consistently has at least double the number of people who apply for asylum, and Germany has sort of three times the amount, sort of broadly speaking. So yeah, we take a fraction of what we should take, but yet it seems like there is an invasion on our southern coast apparently, and there is of all the displaced people, they are all looking to come to the UK, according to the Home Secretary. So, yes, I think the rhetoric only serves the government, and is, factually inaccurate. And it's our job as journalists to sort of call them out on it, alongside campaigners and others doing brilliant work.
Absolutely. So yeah, you've recently written a really brilliant investigation about the UK government sending funds to the Turkish border guard, um, to the border or the coast guards as well. And it really shocked me to read it. Could you kind of give us an overview of this story? I'll have a link to the story, and I think the headline is UK provided 3 million to Turkish border forces to stop migrants. And this is in the Guardian, or was it the Observer, or both?
It was the Guardian.
Ah,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. So within the Home Office, there's a small unit. It's kind of a couple of dozen staff called International Operations Home Office International Ops, which is part of the Intelligence Directorate. So it's kind of difficult to get information out of them. So this was kind of 6 months, maybe even longer, of trying to figure out what this unit actually did. And from documents that we saw, we understood that it was upstream prevention work. So it's basically funding border guards, coast guard, police, along the migrant route. And Turkey is a kind of nexus on that migration route to stop flows of migrants coming into Europe and travelling onto the UK. That's the idea. So Hannah Lucinda Smith, she's a brilliant journalist based in Istanbul. We were trying to figure out kind of what money was going to Turkey, basically. And we found that 9 vehicles were being handed over, and the deputy ambassador was being photographed in local press, handing over these 9 vehicles to to the national police, actually, but local police manning that border. And then there was other equipment and training, we found out, all prevention measures to basically stop people travelling over that border. And the border with Iran is known to be one of the most violent along that entire route. So people I spoke to said, the Greek police, the French police, the Italian police, they beat you. They're incredibly violent, but they're nothing by comparison to the Turkish border police on that border with Iran, who have absolutely no scruples. And one guy was like, that I was beaten along every border, but on that Turkey-Iran border, they will kill you. You know,
Jesus.
they don't have any scruples whatsoever. So Hannah went along to Van and went along to the eastern border, the Turkey-Iran border, and was gathering evidence about rounds being fired at the feet of children as they ran away. And she spoke to, I don't know how much I can say about, because she's going to report it slightly further down the line, but she spoke to a man who travelled over that border with his family, whose 2-year-old child, along with their 2-year-old child, they were all pushed back into Iran, into the mountains, and it was winter, it was snowing, and the child died, froze to death on his back. Because of that pushback. If they'd been allowed into Turkey, they might have survived. And he had to bury his child in the snow, and his fingers froze. They had to be amputated. Then there was another case where a family were detained, and the men and young boys were separated from the women and girls, and they were forced to strip down to their underwear. Then they were brought back out of the police station, and they were a hole was cut into the barbed wire, and they were forced back just in their underwear, again in very, very cold conditions. So it's like absolutely horrific abuse, kind of humiliation tactics, as well as everything else. Kind of, the police reportedly laughing at people and firing live rounds at the feet of children. I mean, can't get any more brutal than that, really. So yeah, hearing that was sort of how UK taxpayers' money was being used to stop people reaching the UK, this kind of deterrent measure, like upstream, was really, really shocking. And yeah, it took us a long time to try and get the information out, but we got there. And yeah, I'm hoping that we can kind of continue the work about what the Home Office International Ops team is doing in other countries as well.
Yeah, that's really grim. Like, because obviously in Iran, it's having its like there was big protests there, right? There's a huge crackdown on women protesting for their rights and people supporting them. So it's really terrible, like optically as well, for the UK government to be involved in this abuse of people trying to escape that, or people coming from Afghanistan as well. That's really terrible. Um, and you found where was the money? It was like £3 million. Do you know where that came from? I think it mentioned in the report that it was the overseas aid budget. Like what is
Yeah,
that?
it was the overseas aid budget, but funneled through. So the FCDO had links to it. Obviously, it was the ODA.
The FCDO is the Foreign and Commonwealth Office.
Yeah, which is now, it used to be DFID, and DFID was rolled into the FCO, so it's now the FCDO, the Development Department as well. And so it came from the ODA budget, and it was given to this tiny unit, which is kind of interesting that it's kept so secret, but that's because it's part of the Intelligence Directorate. But yeah, I mean, what's kind of interesting is that the UK government, regardless of which department it is bankrolling these horrific abuses happening on borders along the migration route, and Turkey being at the nexus at that on that route is sort of doubly horrific. My job was basically, from this side, Hannah was sort of documenting the abuses happening in Turkey, and my job was to try and get sources from within this tiny unit to speak, which was what proved the most time consuming. And yeah, and what they told me was, I mean, some people were incredibly candid about what they were doing, almost kind of proud of what they were doing, actually. And I spoke to the head of the unit, who ended up, he actually said that he was very happy to speak on record, but the press office then got involved, and we've already spoken about the press office. And they pushed back very strongly and said, no, he will not meet with you, but we can issue a statement, which they did dutifully. But he was really keen to speak about the groundbreaking work, in his words, that the Home Office International Ops were doing overseas, and we already had evidence of what the UK taxpayers' money was being used for. So hearing that it was groundbreaking work was quite a surprise. So unfortunately, I didn't get to speak to him, but I did get to speak to people who work for him, and worked very recently for him. So we got close. We got close as close as we could, and to understand what was going on there.
And you said that the money went towards nine vehicles. What were these vehicles? I think in the article it links to this. The article in the Guardian, it links to the local one you mentioned in a Turkish press, right? What were those vehicles?
So those vehicles are for patrols on the border with Iran, so police patrols. They're all armed, obviously, and then other equipment was being given over. So we just saw equipment and training. So the training was in preventative measures, which insinuates, although we didn't say this because you need hard, fast evidence that the training was going directly to pushing people back. But yes, it says equipment and training, so that money was going directly to that.
And it's just like the idea that it's upstream, to stop people from getting to Europe, and there's a lot of people talk a lot about people that are interested in migration and people on the move and stuff. Often talk about the EU-Turkey deal, but like this thing that you've uncovered is like it's like a UK-Turkey deal that's I've never heard of before. And that's
it's interesting that there's like post-Brexit there was no mechanism in place to kind of manage the flows of migrants over the border. So the UK, this is basically the beginnings of the UK, attempting to develop some kind of mechanism to stop migrants quite far down the route and to push them back.
Yeah, because Turkey, Iran is very far away from the UK, isn't it? To be involved, to be sort of helping that, it's pretty crazy.
Yeah, sort of tackling the problem at source.
Yeah. It's just I just find it the cruelty of it is just makes me speechless. It's hard to just think about what's happening there. And you've got sources saying that Turkey is an important place. Do you know why that is? I mean, obviously, I think we've kind of discussed this really.
They said Turkey is a country of emerging importance, and it has been particularly over the last 2 to 3 years, which was interesting because that was the period that we were particularly looking at. And there was something called Project Hunter. There were a couple of different projects, but Project Hunter, also from ODA funding, was being used to tackle illegal migration. Of which there is no such thing, but tackling irregular routes at source. So basically, what this various different Home Office contacts told me and FCDO contacts told me was through intelligence they can figure out the routes that people take, the routes that the smugglers push migrants down as well, and they can pass that information to the police, who then, having been given these 9 vehicles and other equipment and training from the UK government, can push those people back. They can also interview migrants who've travelled along that route and figure out what routes they've taken and pass that information back to the police. So basically, it's passing intelligence directly back to these border guards, Coast Guard and land forces, border forces, who can then force migrants back down those routes. And another source told me Turkey basically can ask for reinforcement. So they can say, we've got this many border officers working on this border, but we need more. We need to be able to fund more positions. So we need X many, this was the exact quote, we need X many police officers. So we will give them that. We will essentially fund that directly, what they ask for. And then they will put an operational plan in place to stop it. The operational plan being police officers carrying out activities on that border. And the other thing I heard was the Home Office now in Turkey anyway, I don't know so much about other embassies, they were looking into that, has more staff in embassies than FCDO staff.
Wow.
Migration issues. So and the approach is seen quite differently. So the Home Office working internationally has quite an adversarial approach. So somebody said, actually a Home Office source said, the Home Office, my department, is seen as quite adversarial when working internationally, whereas the FCDO, given its kind of warm bilateral, multilateral relations and it's kind of like, well, its kind of remit to build diplomatic relations is seen as very collegiate and communicative and cooperative, but the Home Office is seen in completely the opposite way.
Weird situation, isn't it? That
Yeah.
there was another thing that was mentioned in your article. I think a source told you that the Home Office was talking to people that's arrived in the UK, found
Mm.
out the routes from them, and then informed this. They've informed what they've said back to the Turkish border guards.
Yeah.
And that is just like it's wild. Like 'cause
Yeah.
those people may I don't know, but maybe some of those people experience horrible situations at that border, and now that's being used to help the Turkish border guards do it again. Just
Yeah, yeah.
crazy.
It's seen as intelligence gathering, and yeah, I mean, I have spoken to people who've been in some of those interviews, and not that it's not done under duress, but there's definitely, it's quite an intimidating situation to be in, and can be very re-traumatizing for people who have travelled along those routes and potentially been beaten or tortured or held, arbitrarily detained, or pushed back and tried again. I mean, any number of things could have happened to people, and then they're having to relive those experiences. So, yeah, that's another really dehumanizing and horrific element to this.
That's just there's a side thing here that that's just what you've said there has just reminded me of something that I think about quite a lot is when I've interviewed asylum seekers, refugees, or people on the move. Um, I'm often wary that there's a chance that what my questions can re-traumatize them or bring up horrible experiences that they've been through. Um, how do you sort of deal with that? I keep changing my perspective on that. I
Mm.
feel well. Yeah, let's see what you say. Yeah, what do you think about that?
Yeah, a number of different ways. I always offer anonymity, of course, but I also always say to people in advance, bring somebody if you want somebody there in the interview. I usually try and speak to people face to face or travel to where they are. I think that really helps, and I always say bring someone that you trust. That could be a friend, or it could be I met someone last week who was a medic who was supporting somebody. It could be an interpreter, somebody that they really trust, somebody from a charity, a campaigner, or otherwise. So that can help to put people's minds at ease. I also, yeah, I always offer anonymity, but I also then say, if there's a question that you're not comfortable answering, then no problem, we can move on. And I generally tend to send quotes to people, particularly people who speak English, or we can do this via translation. I send quotes to people to kind of clear in advance so that they have some agency over their story before it's published. So, I mean, there's probably multiple other ways that I can't think of right now, but there's lots of other ways that I can sort of think to protect sources. And often I find people say, "Oh, no problem. I want my story out there. It's kind of representative of a number of different people from my country or in this situation. So no problem to print my name." Or just print my first name, or no problem to print my location. But I'm really wary about doing that. So
Mm.
I always offer anonymity. When people waive that right, I, in general, will speak to an editor about it and say they've waived the right. I think I'll probably protect them anyway.
Mm.
Just make sure that there's no sort of jigsaw identification, so that it's really easy to get back to people. I'm very, very conscious of that, and I often worry about that immediately before publication. It's always I go through everything with a fine tooth comb and think, could this person be traced back? Um, and yeah, I'm dealing with a case at the moment where I'm sort of constantly thinking about this, like, by saying that, could that person be traced back? And often the answer is yes.
Mm.
And I don't think it's worth it, particularly when that person's given their time and they've trusted me to tell their story. I'm very, very careful about that.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. A thing I've thought about a lot. I had an experience in Calais once, the jungle, where I was there after it had been demolished, and I was with this charity that I think it was Care for Calais. I was with, or it might have been Refugee Community Kitchen. Can't remember which. But we were handing out food there, and I was talking to people. Told them I was a journalist, but I didn't have a camera on me or anything. And this different journalist, and I'm not sure where they were from. They might have been from China or Taiwan, Hong Kong, or Japan or something. I'm not sure where they're from, but they arrived and just got their cameras out straight away, and then people were throwing rocks at them, and then they kind of drove off. And when they came back, and I approached them afterwards, was like, they don't want to be filmed. People here, you need to like get their permission. So like I just think it's poor sort of journalism to run up to someone and just ram a microphone in their face or a camera or whatever. It's like, I find it hard to talk to people when they're on the move. I feel like it's, unless they want to speak. But anyway, this is kind of side stuff.
I think it's really, really relevant. And that, like what someone said the other day, somebody who works in TV was saying, "Oh, to the best of your knowledge, do you know of a way that we can get a camera on a dinghy?" And I was like, "I'm not going to like endorse that at all." And I just said, you need to be really. It would be incredibly irresponsible to put a camera on a boat and put, the smugglers are there putting people on boats. They are not in the dinghies themselves when they're at sea, but they are, that would put somebody in an incredibly precarious and dangerous, life-threatening situation. You do not do that. So I was really, it worries me that people are so desperate to get a story and are under so much pressure from editors that they will almost go to any lengths to not consider the risks to very vulnerable people.
Yeah, that's an immensely bad idea. And this video is often on social media of people who've done that journey. If they desperately need that footage, it's out there. But yeah, that is just crazy. So let's move on to the second article that you've written recently. I think it was in May, or it may have been April. It was recently. And it was, the article was entitled "Asylum Seekers Abused and Intimidated by Staff in Home Office Hotels." So yeah, could you tell us about this story, Nicola?
Oh, this piece was incredibly hard fought. So the background is, in February, I'm sure many people will remember, there were anti-migrant protests outside the Suites Hotel in Knowsley, Kirby border, just outside Liverpool, sparked through WhatsApp and social media. Those who attended, I've spoken to people who attended that protest, and they say it started very peacefully. It was just, some locals who were really disgruntled because the hotel had been used for weddings and people's weddings had to be cancelled, etc. And some of the hotels around Liverpool were, really popular hotels that locals stayed in, and there were like events held there and stuff. And they had closed their doors to house migrants. But this protest, which I think there was, certainly 500 plus people outside this hotel, turned very violent. A police car was set on fire. There was lots of racist chanting happening outside. Patriotic Alternative, the largest far-right neo-Nazi fascist party in the country, were present, and then they subsequently started protests, a couple of weeks afterwards in outside hotels in Skegness and elsewhere in the country, holding banners with things like "Stop the Invasion," stop words directly out of Braverman's mouth. So this was really worrying state of affairs. And so somebody came to me and says, I actually said I was going to be in Liverpool. I was there on a different story. And I tend to travel quite a lot around the UK, and someone messaged me and said that they had worked in, I have to be very careful here, had worked in one of the larger hotels in Liverpool, and they had seen some incidents had unfolded while they were working there that really unsettled them. So we arranged to meet. I kind of obviously verified they were who they said they were, etc. And we met when I was in Liverpool. This person was incredibly nervous about meeting, had never gone to the press about anything before, but was so, unsettled isn't even really the word. They were kind of angry, actually, about what they'd seen and really, really wanted it out there. And so they said, a man with schizophrenia, a very vulnerable man, known to have schizophrenia. The hotel staff managed this person's medication. sent them off in taxis for medical appointments. So, that his condition was very well known to the staff at the hotel. They ran this man into his room. He locked the door, and they kicked the door and rattled the doorknob and shouted abuse in at him and said things like, "If I see you outside, you better run." So it really threatened him.
Jesus.
They would say things like, if people came into the office in one of the, again, larger hotels in Liverpool, they would deny people food and water outside of meal times, including children. And they would say things like, am I allowed to swear on them?
Yeah, go for it.
They would say things like, fuck off and get out of the office. And they'd kind of flick their hand like, get out of my way. And then they would use racist language, and really vile language would be used against people when they were in earshot. So, yeah, all of this had really, really bothered this person, and they had quit. So I wondered whether they might have any colleagues who would speak to me as well. And I was subsequently put in touch with some other sources who had worked at that hotels, at the 5 hotels around Liverpool which house asylum seekers, and who still work there. I then took it to my editor at the Observer and said, this is a really strong story, blah, blah. He was in agreement about that, and it was like weeks and weeks and weeks of wrangling with Serco. So Serco is the subcontractor who runs these 5 hotels, and they went out of their way to kill the story. The Home Office did as well, but to a slightly lesser extent. But Serco kept saying, these are baseless claims, these are allegations from whistleblowers, unidentified whistleblowers. They were obviously unidentified for a reason. There is no grounds for these allegations whatsoever. So I went back, this obviously isn't reported, but I went back to Serco with the names of the individuals who'd been accused, the locations of the hotels where these incidents are said to have taken place, and in some instances, the dates when they were said to have taken place. So that was kind of like quite robust, background information, which I couldn't have got from people who weren't very involved or had seen these incidents firsthand. But they continued to push back, and they kept saying, these people who you've named are very respected members of staff, we totally back them, blah, blah, blah. Countless phone calls with my editor, lawyers, and at one point I thought I would understand if they don't want to run this story, not because I don't think they think it's a very good story, because they kept saying, I think it's really important that we put this out there, but because the legal threats started coming in, and they were quite strong. There was very strong pushback, but legal threats that were kind of like building and building and building. Constant references to me being a freelancer as well, which obviously kind of worried me that they would take kind of individual claims out as well as claims against the paper. I was assured that I would be backed. But yes, obviously as a freelancer, that is a bit of a worry. I actually ended up calling one of the hotels and then got, recording of one of the hotel managers who was one of those accused, kind of openly admitting some of the things that I was. So I had a lot of evidence. I had a lot of backing from editors. I had a lot of, I really backed my sources as well. Anyway, the paper went ahead and published, which I was really pleased about, but it was obviously quite nerve-wracking. And within days, the person I'd spoken to on the phone and all of the names I had given to Serco were fired.
Jesus.
And it had been kind of needlessly time-consuming. But they continued to push back after publication. So they came back and said, I put out a tweet and said, these people have been fired. They've got others have got meetings, so it looks like their futures are uncertain as well. And they came back and said, this is untrue, please delete your tweet. And I said, can you confirm that these people still work for Serco at these hotels? And they came back and said, we can confirm that they still work for us. Sorry, that they no longer work for us. Quite an important nuance there. They no longer work for us. Full stop. That was it. So I was like, oh God, I mean, we've got you. Like, you haven't got a leg to stand on. So it had been needlessly time consuming. They had just tried to intimidate me as a freelancer, my editor. They had gone to the head of legal services, the director of legal services at the Guardian and Observer group. And they had done everything they could to go out of their way to kill this story. But this is a subcontractor who gets like 1.9 billion a year from the Home Office to run these services. So it was in their interest to try and push back. But yeah, I'm just really glad the story got out there. And ever since, I'm contacted very regularly, almost daily by people who work in these hotels or worked in these hotels until recently, saying, we know of incidents, up and down the country where this kind of thing is happening. So I believe, and we believe at the Observer, that it's the tip of the iceberg, that there could be many, many more incidents like this.
Yeah, I've heard from people who've been in these situations, of similar situations, similar experiences to what you had in your story. So it's like, yeah, I would not be surprised at all if it's just the tip of the iceberg. It's a really horrible situation, and like the staff that these people, your sources, or the people that were sacked, and people who spoke out about it, I feel really bad for them, because they're like, I don't know if they're like, I'm guessing they're not mental health professionals and stuff, or they're not really trained to be looking after people who have probably post-traumatic stress disorder or schizophrenia and other whatever other things. So it's just a really fucked up situation.
Yeah, but like, they shouldn't. I mean, like, the Circa were going through high street recruitment agencies to get these people in. And these are people working, senior managers working in hotels, and not just in these 5 hotels, like up and down the country, working in asylum hotels, who have been recruited on kind of minimum wage contract, 0 hours contracts, actually. So the people working in the hotels have absolutely, as you say, no experience. They've been, a lot of the people in Liverpool hotels were hired direct from COVID testing centres, security, working in, clubs. They have absolutely no experience of the asylum system. That's not to kind of kind of talk badly about the people that are being recruited. They've just gone through a high street recruitment agency and been hired. And they've been given slightly more than they would be given in other jobs. So that's the reason why they've taken them. So some of my sources, I understand their motivation for doing those jobs, but as you say, they have no experience of working in the asylum system. They have no experience of working with people who are highly traumatized, very, very vulnerable people, and they're given no training whatsoever. They're not even given a day of training. They're just chucked into these environments, and kind of are a bit shell shocked a lot of the time. And yeah, I mean, they're hiring people that are kind of like, in these instances, in these 5 hotels, I can't speak for other hotels, but they're hiring people who have not got the right motivations for being there. I mean, that's kind of like a really, really understated way of saying, these people are ill-equipped to deal with the set of circumstances that they've been given, and they are inappropriately recruited, and it was right that those people were fired.
And it's wild that, like you said, that they got these people from, they hired them from high street recruitment agencies. Like, I've been in those. I've in the past, I've got work through recruitment agencies and stuff, but I can't imagine what it'd be like to be put in that situation. You know what I mean? They shouldn't be there. Like, they're not. You're not trained to be dealing with this situation. Right? It's just, it is crazy. Well, Nicola, thanks so much for telling us about that story. Was there, like, I'm going to move on to the big final question in a moment, but was there anything else you wanted to talk about that story, or any of the stories, or this kind of thing?
I don't know whether I don't know whether it's worth talking about hotels.
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah. I suppose it's actually quite a good bit of context that maybe I should have said before we started talking about this, but that's okay. It's the nature of podcasting. Why are there asylum seekers in hotels? I think we've covered this in previous episodes of the podcast, actually, but people might be listening to this for the very first time. Maybe you can tell us about what's the reason why because there's a lot of like, the far right and people also just on the general right will say, that these asylum seekers are in lap of luxury. I think they picture that they're in hotels and like 4-star, 5-star hotels or whatever in a hot tub and stuff like this, but that's not the situation at all, right?
No, I mean, so it started during COVID, really. It started slightly before that, but it mainly started during COVID. There was the Everyone In campaign, which was basically ensuring that nobody was left on the streets during the pandemic. And so they took out these contracts with individual hotels up and down the country and got Serco, Mears, various other, Clear Springs Ready Homes, various other subcontractors to manage them. And they just never really moved anybody out. And they've been, ever since then, they've been kind of mired in controversy. So now there's like around 400 hotels across the UK housing asylum seekers, so huge numbers, and it's just growing and growing and growing. And they're actually taking out individual contracts with hotels rather than going via local authorities. So that's really pissing off local communities, understandably. The fact that they're not consulted. So in Brighton, obviously, there was the case where children are regularly housed in hotels with adults. Asylum-seeking children, unaccompanied children, actually, are housed with adults, which is incredibly dangerous. But in Brighton, over 150 children are still missing from this, in Brighton and Hove area, over 150 children are still missing from this one hotel, believed to be exploited into county lines, exploited by criminal gangs operating in the UK. The Home Office have said very little about that. And there's a hotel I visit relatively close to where I live, where the resources have just been cut back and cut back and cut back. So there's, capacity of 250 people can stay at this hotel, and they've got like a maximum of 8 staff working there. So, in its, when it was open to the public, there would have been, I don't know how many staff even, but there would have been many more than 8. But they now don't, obviously they don't have cleaners, they don't have caterers, they don't have service staff, they just have like people kind of roaming about, not really sure what to do with themselves and kind of managing. There's usually one person on security on the door who kind of sign people in and out, but that's about it. And asylum seekers are just brought there and just sort of shoved into these rooms and left to languish and given, I think it's £9.10 a week. The food is awful. I'm regularly sent photos of kind of mould on food and bed bugs running over children staying in these rooms. And yeah, they're kind of developing these contracts and taking out more and more all the time. And Priti Patel during her tenure I've heard from Home Office officials, instructed her officials to begin looking at any alternative sites, so like student halls, cruise ships, disused RAF bases, which are still going on, of course, in Wethersfield and Scampton in Lincolnshire, and Wethersfield in Braintree and Essex, and barges, of which they're now reported to have spent £1.6 billion on a contract. And now, kind of pre-general election, they're scrabbling around to just try and find different accommodation structures, because the hotels, alongside the optics of the small boats themselves, the hotels are kind of the next most contentious thing. So you regularly hear people saying, 4-star, 5-star hotels with spas, blah, 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 which are usually, they're pretty much always closed. Like, nobody can use them. And actually, people don't feel safe leaving the hotels because of what happened in Knowsley, in Skegness and elsewhere. So usually people just go into the hotels and stay there. They're just happy. They're just happy to be in a safe place, and they don't really even feel the need to leave. So there's so little interaction in these towns, but it's just built up in the press as this really big tension between local communities and asylum seekers staying in the hotels. And I went to Skegness a month ago or so, and I was speaking to hotel owners there working on the seafront, and they were saying the local community here never meet asylum seekers and or refugees. They never meet asylum seekers staying in these hotels. So there isn't the tension that it appears to be in the press. There was maybe 100, 150 people at a protest back in February off the back of the Knowsley protest, but it's not nearly as big an issue or a problem for locals as it's built up to be. And yeah, I just think that the hotel issue, like pre-general election, it's in the Conservatives Party's interest to make that a really toxic kind of political debate or point of discussion, instead of just looking for alternative accommodation structures.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as we get closer to the general election, it's just going to ramp up, isn't it, and get much worse. And it's just the attention and the money that goes into stopping people from coming here or housing them in hotels and stuff. It could be used in such a better way, a humane way that helps people come here safely.
Use it to clear the backlog.
Yeah.
Use it to get more decision makers in to process claims more quickly. Clear the legacy backlog, but also just speed up the processing of claims and get better trained, more experienced decision makers into those posts.
Absolutely. I think, Nicola, in the interest of time, I think we should kind of wrap up, get to this last question. I really, really enjoyed talking to you. It's been really good. Maybe we should get you on another time. I'm pretty sure by the time I publish this podcast, you've probably written another investigation by then. So let me ask you, this is the final question I always ask everyone on the podcast. And how do you feel about the direction that we're going in regards to asylum seekers? We often call them people on the move on the podcast, or refugees, asylum seekers, people on the move. In returns for that, either in the UK or Europe and the whole world, actually, how do you feel about the future and where we're going? Because I've said on this podcast a lot that I feel like we're heading to an absolute dystopian nightmare. Maybe we're already there in terms of asylum seekers, but I don't know. Maybe I'm also looking for a bit of hope.
I'm an optimist, so hopefully hopefully there'll be some sort of optimistic note. But I'll begin on a sort of more pessimistic note. I guess there's few sort of indications that it's going to get any better. You've got climate crisis, political instability around the world, conflict, gross inequalities, poverty. There's various different drivers. And within the UK, which is what I focus on, there's likely to be, I would say, more deaths in the Channel, just because of the under-resourcing and inexperience happening on the front line on the Cape Coast on our side. So sort of the first rung, alongside decision makers, and the sort of front line of the asylum system is so inadequately resourced and ill-equipped to deal with these issues. I'd also expect to see more abuse and violence taking place in hotels as tension grows within communities, and particularly as it's ramped up pre-general election over the next year or so. I think the general election will be it feels to me a bit pre-Brexit, the narrative at the moment, like the rhetoric coming out from the government, but also the sort of I travel a lot around the UK and I speak to different communities in Skegness and Liverpool and Sheffield and Preston and Cardiff. I mean, various different places that I've been very recently. I speak to people who, there's a range of views, of course, but I think the press, I think journalists have a lot to answer for. Of course, the government do as well, but I'm not particularly optimistic pre-election that it will do anything except ramp up the rhetoric and the fear-mongering and sort of stoking the divisions in a sort of pre-Brexit way. But I'm sort of searching for a positive note, because I want to end on a positive note. From asylum seekers' point of view, they just want to keep their heads down and start to think about rebuilding their lives. And I'm thinking of one family I met in northern France a couple of months ago who have now arrived in the UK, and the conditions in which they live are horrendous, but they're just really happy to have a safe roof over their head, to be safe and to be alive. And if nothing else, that's worth celebrating.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think, hopefully the government will change at the next election. Things in that way will change as well. And I always find hoping like the activists groups, the people that are actually doing stuff to help asylum seekers. There's lots of food banks and things like this that are helping people, right? And I always think that's amazing when like the government fails. There's often a lot of activists, people doing stuff.
I mean, like the goodwill of volunteers, I would say, is almost single-handedly propping up the asylum system at this point. It's kind of on the verge of collapse, but it's not quite there yet, but it is collapsing or might collapse. And without volunteers who are amazing, I mean, I meet some amazing individuals in this job, and without them, like, you know, I don't know what would happen to, also in northern France, but I don't know what would happen to people on the move.
Yeah, well, Nicola, that was really great. How can people find your work or follow you on social media and this kind of thing?
So I'm at Nicola Kelly on Twitter, quite easy. My Instagram is private, but I'm at Nicola NK Kelly, I think. Everyone calls me NK. So that's why NK is in there, at Nicola NK Kelly. And my email is just standard Guardian format, nicola.kelly@theguardian.com.
Cool, and I'll have links to your stories that have been in the Guardian. If there's any that you want me to put in there, I can stick those in as well. It's been a pleasure, Nicola. Thank you so much for your time. I'll be in touch.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks for having me.
All right, that was episode 42 of the Civil Fleet podcast. Thanks very much for listening. Thanks again to Nicola for coming on the podcast. It's been really good to have her on. Wanted to get her on for a while. Right. And since we've recorded this interview, actually, Nicola's already published another story. She's published the first in a series of articles she's going to write on people who have gone missing in the Channel. You can find that in the Independent newspaper, or online actually, and I'll have a link to that in the show notes, so do check them out if you like. So hopefully we'll have another episode out this month. I'm turning 40 at the end of it, so I don't know, maybe not. We'll see, but we should have something out in August. I hope you've enjoyed this one. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. If you'd like to help us out to keep platforming the people that we have, if you'd like to help us to run this thing, which isn't that expensive, but any help is great, you can do so at ko-fi.com/civilfleet. That's ko-fi.com/civilfleet. Any help that you give will be greatly appreciated. Right then, I'll see you soon. Thanks very much. Cheers.